The morning of her 18th birthday, Mary Ellis awoke with a knot in her stomach, a feeling she could not quite name but which made her fingers tremble as she braided her hair. The small cabin smelled faintly of coffee, but it did nothing to calm her nerves. She knew something was different, something heavy, because her father had been pacing since dawn, his boots dragging against the wooden floor. When he finally sat across from her at the table, his eyes did not meet hers. His words came out clipped, as if he had rehearsed them in his head but still hated the sound of them. Tom Callahan needed a wife, he explained. His wife had died the winter before, leaving behind 3 children and a house too big for one man to manage alone. The ranch stretched far and wide, cattle to tend, fields to work, fences to mend. And a man like Tom, though respected, had no time to cook, no time to sew, no time to mother his children. Her father's debts had grown too heavy, his lungs weaker by the week. Tom's offer was not only honorable, it was survival. Mary's hands clenched together tightly on her lap, the tips of her fingers white. She wanted to scream that she was too young, that she had barely lived, that she had dreamed of teaching children in the schoolhouse or maybe seeing the bigger towns she'd only heard about. She wanted to ask why her life had to be bargained away for debts that weren't hers. But in their world, daughters did not ask such questions. They obeyed, and they carried the weight handed to them. Her father's voice broke once, softening just slightly when he said, "You'll be looked after, Mary." Tom's a good man. Hard, yes, but good. By midday she was packed, her small bundle of belongings tied in a faded cloth. She climbed into the wagon, the boards cold under her, and the sound of the wheels crunching over dirt filled the silence her father left behind. She didn't look back, she couldn't. The land stretched wide and unforgiving as the wagon rolled toward the Callahan ranch. Fences ran along the ridges, the grass brittle under the late summer sun. The house stood tall but tired, its paint fading, its porch leaning ever so slightly, like a man weary from carrying too much for too long. Tom was waiting when the wagon pulled in. He stood with his hat in his hands, broad-shouldered, sun-darkened skin, a jaw set firm as stone. He was older, perhaps twice her age, and in his eyes there was something unreadable, grief that hadn't yet loosened its grip. "Mary," he said with a small nod, his voice steady, almost too steady, as though emotion were something he couldn't allow himself to show. "Thank you for coming." Her throat tightened, but she forced her lips into something resembling a smile. The words she wanted to say, "I didn't choose this, I don't know if I can do this," remained locked inside. The first thing she noticed as she stepped into the house was the silence. Not the comfortable kind, but the kind that hummed with absence. And then she saw them, 3 children peering from around corners and doorways. The oldest was Sam, no more than 12, his expression wary, his jaw set in defiance. Beside him, Clara, delicate but sharp-eyed at 9, held herself with the air of someone ready to guard her mother's memory fiercely. The youngest, Jacob, just 5, clung to his father's trousers, his wide eyes filled with both fear and curiosity. None of them smiled, none of them spoke. That evening, Mary cooked the meal with hands that shook every time she reached for a pot. The smell of cornbread filled the kitchen, mingling with the rich scent of stew. The children sat at the table, but the silence was thick, punctuated only by the clink of spoons. Tom barely looked up, his attention fixed on his food, as though conversation was too heavy a burden to carry. Mary forced mouthfuls down her throat, her stomach in knots. When the dishes were cleared and the lamps turned low, Tom showed her to the spare room. "This'll be yours," he said, pausing at the door. His voice was kind enough, but distant, careful. He gave her space, never once pressing closer than courtesy demanded. She nodded, murmured her thanks, and once the door closed, her composure broke. She pressed her face into the pillow, the fabric rough against her cheek, and let the tears she'd been holding back finally fall. The walls felt foreign, the air colder than she'd imagined. She had been traded into this life, and though Tom was not cruel, she felt like a stranger, unwelcomed, unseen. The days began to blend together. Morning chores bled into afternoons filled with cooking, mending, scrubbing floors. The work was endless, the silence thicker than the dust that coated every window sill. Sam muttered under his breath when she tried to guide him. "You're not my mother," he spat once, the words like a blade. Clara avoided her eyes, slipping from rooms when Mary entered. Jacob only spoke when he wanted food or water, his small voice hesitant, as though speaking too much might betray something sacred. And Tom was a shadow of a man. He worked long hours on the land, his back bent, his face hardened by sun and grief. At the table, he spoke politely but briefly. At night, he disappeared into his own solitude, leaving Mary alone with her thoughts. But there were cracks in the walls they'd built. One evening, Mary stepped outside to fetch water and found Sam struggling with a horse far too big for him. His hands fumbled with the saddle straps, his body too small to hold the reins steady. The horse shifted, jerking suddenly, and Sam slipped, nearly caught beneath its hooves. Without thinking, Mary dropped the bucket and rushed forward, seizing the reins with both hands, pulling Sam clear. Her heart thundered in her chest, anger spilling out before she could stop it. "Are you trying to get yourself killed?" Sam's eyes flashed as he jerked free of her grasp. "You're not my mother. Don't tell me what to do." Her chest ached at his words, but she steadied her voice, softening despite the sting. "I don't want to be your mother, Sam. But I don't want to bury you either." For a fleeting moment, his anger faltered. He looked at her as though he wanted to argue, but the words caught in his throat. He didn't thank her, didn't apologize, but he also didn't storm away. He lingered, unsure, before finally walking back toward the house. That night, lying awake in her narrow bed, Mary turned those words over in her mind. If she was ever to find her place here, it would not be by trying to replace their mother. That space was sacred, untouchable. Her role would have to be something different, something the children could accept in their own time. She stared at the ceiling, listening to the faint creak of the house in the wind. She felt the weight of everything pressing down on her. Her youth, her loneliness, the burden of being bound to a man she hardly knew, and 3 children who wanted nothing from her. Yet beneath that weight, a small ember flickered. A thought she could not shake. Maybe she hadn't chosen this path. Maybe it wasn't fair, but she was here now. And if she could not escape it, perhaps, just perhaps, she could find a way to build something new within it. Her tears that night were quieter, less desperate. And when morning came, she rose before the sun, tied her apron, and faced another day. Not because she wanted to, but because she had no choice but to keep moving forward. And in her heart, though she didn't yet know it, the first threads of something unexpected were beginning to take shape. The first snow came earlier than anyone expected, drifting across the wide plains in sheets of white that clung to every fence post and tree branch. The ranch seemed smaller beneath the weight of it, the barns hunched against the cold, the cattle restless in their pens. Mary had been on the ranch 3 months by then, and though the air still carried tension, she had begun to change in ways she hadn't thought possible. Her hands were rough now, fingers calloused from mending and scrubbing, her back no longer aching from chores that had once seemed impossible. She had grown steadier, stronger, her body learning the rhythm of ranch life. And though she still felt like an outsider, she had begun to notice subtle shifts around her. Tom had stopped thanking her in clipped words and instead allowed quiet silences between them that no longer felt sharp but almost gentle. Jacob had started climbing into her lap some evenings, small and timid at first, then with a trust that settled in her chest like warmth. Sam's sharp remarks still stung, but now he sometimes lingered to watch her cook, curiosity softening his expression even when his pride would not let him speak. Clara, however, remained the most guarded, her eyes narrowing whenever Mary tried too hard, as though she were trespassing in a sacred memory. The storm rolled in heavy and fast. The winds howled through the cracks of the house, rattling the shutters, and by nightfall the land was buried under thick snow. That was when Clara's cough began. It was small at first, just a dry sound as she sat curled in the corner with her sewing. Mary noticed, her heart tightening, but she said nothing, not wanting to stir alarm. By the next morning the cough had deepened, and Clara's skin felt hot beneath her pale face. Tom frowned, pacing the floor, his jaw tight. Sam was sent to the barn, Jacob clung to Mary's skirts, and the house grew tense with fear. By nightfall Clara's fever had risen dangerously. Her breaths came shallow, her cheeks flushed with a frightening heat. Tom's mask of control cracked then, his hands trembling as he stood helpless at the edge of his daughter's bed. "I'll fetch the doctor," he said, his voice breaking. But when he tried to leave, the storm howled so fiercely that even he knew the road was impossible. "We'll lose her," he whispered, the words raw, his grief surfacing in a way Mary had never seen before. Mary didn't allow herself to panic. She remembered her grandmother's hands, steady and sure as she worked with herbs and poultices, the lessons whispered by the hearth in a time that felt far away now. She gathered what she could, honey, peppermint leaves she had dried, cloths she soaked in cool water, and settled beside Clara. Hour after hour, She wiped the girl's brow, held her hand, coaxed her to sip water. When Clara cried for her mother in her fever, Mary whispered soft words, humming a tune she barely remembered from childhood, her voice shaking but steadying as she sang. The night stretched long, and exhaustion pulled at Mary's bones, but she did not leave Clara's side. Tom paced the room like a caged man, his eyes fixed on his daughter, helplessness carving deep lines into his face. At one point he stopped and stared at Mary, watching the way she cooled the cloth, smoothed it across Clara's burning skin, whispered encouragement as though her voice alone could anchor the child to this world. "I thought I was going to lose her too," he said hoarsely, his words catching as if they burned his throat. Mary reached across the quilt, her hand brushing his. "You didn't," she whispered. "She's still here, and so are you." For the first time, his hand tightened around hers, not with ownership, but with gratitude and something quieter, something unspoken that passed between them in the dim lamplight. When dawn finally came, Clara's fever broke. The girl lay limp and weak, but her breathing steadied, and a pale smile flickered at the corner of her mouth when she opened her eyes. Relief washed over the room, Tom sinking into a chair as though his body could no longer carry the weight of fear. Sam slipped quietly to the doorway, his expression soft with relief though he tried to mask it. Jacob, rubbing his eyes, leaned into Mary as though she were the only steady thing in the world. The following days were slow and tender. Clara remained weak, but she followed Mary with her eyes, no longer glaring but watching, as though she saw her with new understanding. When Mary sat in the kitchen mending clothes, Clara shuffled in and sat near her, silent at first, then asking shy questions. One afternoon, Mary began braiding her own hair while the stew simmered on the stove. Clara's gaze lingered, and in a quiet voice she whispered, "Mama used to braid my hair like that." Mary's throat tightened, but she smiled gently. "Would you like me to braid yours that way too?" Clara hesitated, then nodded, sliding closer. When Mary's fingers brushed through her hair, Clara leaned into the touch, her small shoulders softening for the first time. The simple act broke something in the wall between them, and by the time Tom returned from the barn that evening, he found his daughter sitting with neat braids and a rare, genuine smile on her face. The change did not go unnoticed. In town, word spread that the young bride, barely more than a girl, had saved Tom Callahan's daughter during the storm. Some marveled at her strength, others whispered about the oddness of their arrangement, but the tone had shifted. Mary was no longer the outsider they pitied, she was the girl who had proved herself in the hardest trial a family could face. Tom's presence at the table grew less rigid. He lingered longer over supper, asking her about her day, listening with a quiet attentiveness that surprised her. His grief still lingered, heavy in his eyes, but now there were moments when it softened, replaced by something Mary could not yet name. Sam still bristled at times, but he began to offer to carry buckets or chop wood without being asked. Jacob, with the unguarded honesty of a child, began calling for her in the night when storms frightened him. And Clara, though still tender in her grief, followed Mary's steps as though she trusted her to keep the world from falling apart again. For Mary, the shift was both comforting and terrifying. She had been thrust into this life without choice, still barely more than a child herself, and yet she was beginning to see the outlines of something unexpected. The silence of the ranch was no longer suffocating but filled with small sounds that brought warmth, children's laughter creeping back into corners, the low rumble of Tom's voice as he read by the fire, the quiet moments when she and Clara shared stories before bed. Winter remained harsh, but Mary no longer felt quite so cold. Something was growing in that house, fragile but steady, like a seed taking root beneath the snow. She did not yet dare to call it love, but it was something close, something strong enough that even the people who had doubted them most began to wonder if perhaps this strange, unwanted marriage might be turning into something no one could have predicted.